Rob, really happy to have you here again with us this week. I had a lot of fun talking last week about some principles of DAOs and corporate governance. Today, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper.
Thanks for having me back. We'll get right into it.
So let's talk about the components of traditional entities like corporations. What makes a corporation a corporation? Why did DAOs not fit into that traditional structure?
So in some ways they do, but mostly they don't. And we'll go through it. Legal personality, which a DAO I think ultimately is. It just may be the wrong personality or the wrong thing. Limited liability, which is a big glaring paradox. It just ultimately doesn't have limited liability, or could, depending on how you ultimately structured it. Transferability of shares. I actually think this is one place where a DAO shines. I think that a DAO does really well in a token economics on the chain. You'll have tokens that function and operate really a lot like shares do, and there's actually a better platform to exchange those shares than there is in a private company generally. So that's one place where I think there's some commonality. Central management, traditionally, a traditional corporation has central management through officers and directors. This is exactly the opposite of what a DAO wants to achieve. They want decentralization. And so that's probably where the paradox, I think, glares the most. But I think we could manage through it. And those are sort of the components and the opportunity. I think ultimately a DAO is lending itself, and the popularity of DAOs are lending themselves to innovation and an opportunity, I think, for lawyers to jump in and to help innovate and create structures that ultimately work.
I think that's the key, right? As you and I have kicked around these ideas, working with companies all over the world, groups of people trying to form these DAOs so they're not like traditional companies and they function like real DAOs. That's been a real key thing, is figuring out the structure and I think giving them hope that there is a way forward to do this, right? And that's ultimately what we want to talk about today is what, when you have a traditional entity, traditional contracts, how do you marry those and still preserve the DAO, those things that make DAOs special?
We talked last time, and we'll just cover it really quickly, that both sides need a paradigm shift a bit. Lawyers, I think, have a hard time fitting into this new thing, this new decentralization, because it goes so much in opposition to what we were ultimately trying to create with corporations. But I do believe that there's a path forward.
So what about smart contracts? That term is very, very much kicked around. I've heard very smart people say smart contracts are neither smart nor contracts. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah. So again, there's some innovation opportunity here, and there's also some challenge, of course. And a smart contract is in essence a computable contract. It is really artificial intelligence. It's AI contracting, and they're not all the same. And there is sort of a model that I think a lot of the DAOs are following. But ultimately, a smart contract is going to have different degrees of autonomy built into it. You're going to have high level of autonomy, and you're going to have absolutely zero autonomy. And it's all built based on the developers and how they contrived the smart contract. What I think is a challenge for lawyers is this is in essence artificial intelligence contracting. And so if somebody's out there asking the question, will artificial intelligence ultimately take over lawyers? This is where this I think is playing out to a certain extent. And these are bots. I mean, in essence, they are designed bots, and they are self-creating, self-defined, self-outlined, self-executing, self-enforced without any level of discretion of enforcement, and self-accepting. And so that matters ultimately where you're at, where the DAO is at with respect to autonomy, high degree of autonomy, low degree of autonomy, and what sort of human participation is ultimately going to be allowed. And now that I'm in this space and been in this space for a while, we're seeing both. And we're seeing challenges and problems with both, because ultimately ultimately, if you have a contract that is self-accepting, self-executing, there is no human component within that can sort of deal with problems that may arise. And we all know that problems arise.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's interesting to think about is how, you and I draft contracts all the time. The thought of putting together a contract so perfectly at the onset that it's going to work flawlessly, right? And every time I had a partner ask me early in my career, I said, I spent a ton of time on this contract. He said, is it perfect? I said, not on your life. And so getting to that point where we're revising, and really that's what we do as lawyers, right? We're writing legal code, and that actually has to be baked into real computer code so that it can execute the terms, and really this, getting a lot of the eventualities into a smart contract that's a tough order.
It is. The technology is getting better. I think that they'll advance as you go. I mean, I think that those that really believe in the ultimate autonomy, having these AIs drive the transactions and drive the party relationships and drive the investments or whatever these participants are doing within a DAO. I think there's technology that is advancing that ultimately may perhaps get close, but ultimately you're going to need lawyers to be involved somehow in some way in sort of forming. And frankly, I'm seeing that already in a couple of the DAOs that were generic. That is, their smart contracts were generic, and something goes wrong, a market twists and turns. Those are not thought through, and so all of a sudden you need centralized management to step in and to deal with, help with, and sort out whatever problems may arise. So anyway, it's impossible ultimately, I think, to your point, to pre-draft all eventuality. But the technology, the bot technology, the AI technology is sure trying. And ultimately that matters with respect to corporate form.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's really where I wanted to go next, is talking about, so in a perfect world, we have great smart contracts on top. We have great legal structure underneath. What does that underneath legal structure look like? Can we do it all domestically in the US? Will it have to be international in some component? What's the magic formula? I mean, we're not, like you said, we're not giving away the secret sauce, but tell us a little bit about the ingredients to the secret sauce.
Yeah. So let me go through options. Okay. I in my article that is out there on the internet, I basically outline what I think some of the options are. Let me nuance those just a bit. First option is to do nothing. This actually may work in a perfect world. It may work in a highly controlled, developed artificial intelligence smart contract. It may work in that scenario where the DAO participant comes in, everything is automated, and it just processes one after another. There would be no limited liability in that case, and you would definitely not have any level of centralized leadership to make specific decisions around hiring, paying taxes, or what have you. But for those that are true to decentralization, that's an option, right? So sort of do nothing is one option. The next thing is to, if you're a US-based company, is to domesticate here, to do what you normally do. Go to wherever state you're in or wherever your activity is and file as a limited liability company or file as a corporation and go through the regular process of deciding and choosing. In that case, what we are doing and sort of crafting is a nexus between the entity, the organization itself, and the protocols. So we basically create treasury and create corporate function around treasury, hiring, firing, getting developers on board, making sort of normal corporate decisions and housing that in an entity structure, and then at the same time creating contractual nexus between the protocol platforms and the smart contracts and allowing them to function on their own in decentralization. And this is kind of my puppet model where this is all thought out. Smart contracts basically dictate what sort of things the entity itself will do, basic corporate things. But ultimately, there is no decentralized management. there's no centralized management. It stays decentralized, and they become ultimate puppets of the decentralized organization or the DAO. And that's an option. And I'm seeing that sort of pop up and play out. A couple of states are trying to be more specific and nuanced with their approach. Wyoming is one of them. They've taken their limited liability code and wrapped it around any DAO. And so it's working and not working at the same time. It's working in the sense that it's attracting a lot of these DAOs that are trying to be true to decentralization, to have the override of limited liability and a company. So what we're seeing is there's a trend that's flowing into Wyoming right now because of that. There's other states that are doing the same thing. I just read the other day where Texas is trying to do some things. It's not working in the sense that there are nuances to these structures that don't fully fit into a limited liability structure. There are things that haven't been fully thought through, like UCC code application and some other things, currency codes that are new. And so there's marrying and synthesizing all of those different things. And Wyoming, again, should be commended for what they're doing, but it's not a perfect fit. And a couple of states, Texas, I think Vermont, and a couple other are taking the learnings from that and trying to make adjustments. The other thing that I don't love about that structure is that you still have a certain degree of uncertainty with respect to a federal government overlay. Again, as you know, state to state, the corporations and corporate selection is a state issue, but you're going to have tax issues, you're going to have FCC issues, you're going to have SEC issues, and there's still a lot of uncertainty and being subject to both the state and federal government, I think, can be a challenge. The other model that we like is to quote unquote offshore. And what I mean by that is something that is one jurisdiction that's not the United States. So British Virgin Island, Cayman Islands, we like Singapore, and I'll talk just in a second about Singapore and some of these others. Gibraltar, I think I mentioned before. And, there's some other jurisdictions that are doing a nice job of attracting DAOs, potentially applying whatever corporate form they have to a DAO, and then you have one centralized jurisdiction that you're dealing with. I like that because DAOs tend to be very international anyway. Most of the participants are global, and development too. A lot of the smart contract developers now are not in the United States, and so it makes sense to be truly global and international. There's another form that's becoming more and more popular, and that is what I call a foundation form. It is to look at the two functions of a DAO, look at treasury, and then look at the protocol participation. Treasury really is everything that we would consider traditionally corporate, and to make that a true cost center only, not a profit center, true cost center, and then overlay that as a foundation. 501c3 or whatever the local jurisdiction foundation is. Singapore is applying their foundation law to DAOs, allowing that bifurcation, and then you create something of a contractual nexus between. Now, that may work for some, and it may not work for others. But anyway, that's a trend. There is another trend that's interesting, is that you have on-chain corporations or on-chain companies that are now looking at the DAO space and wanting to participate in a DAO. They're sponsoring a DAO, and they're migrating that functionality into a separate foundation. For whatever reason, there's a lot of altruistic reasons to be doing different things with DAOs. So that's another structure. What I like, if I can end this on what my recommendation is to go offshore. To bifurcate those two functions. Sometimes we could attach a cost center only foundation component and create the foundation with all things treasury, and then create contractual nexus with the actual DAO participants. That's sort of the ideal. Now, it doesn't always work because these are complex organizations with complex objectives and goals, and creating the straight cost center aspect of it just ultimately I don't think works. But you can still create a puppet relationship between an organization, the treasury components, corporate treasury components that ultimately become contractual components to the DAO-based participants. And doing those offshore, I think, is the entity that we're landing on and the one that we're executing on right now the most.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. That's all the time we got today. We'll catch back on the next episode and we'll keep talking.
Thanks for the time.